All right, how are you? Hopefully, you guys are doing well. Uh, I'm feeling substantially better, so Monday looks like it's most definitely a possibility. What that means for you guys is hopefully you're keeping up with all the work, um, and we'll be able to just briefly kind of cover everything that we talked about and hit the highlights. And then get right into it. Probably with, I don't know, a quiz or a notebook check or something along those lines to make sure that you guys are on par with where you need to be. So, this section is Americans Face Hard Times. It's not super lengthy in notes, but it is kind of lengthy in material, if that makes any sense. Um, and believe it or not, this is actually the last section of Standard 6. And so, as I mentioned before break, we decided as a history department to combine 6 and 7 into one test because we've only been doing Standard 6. This will be day 4 now, and we're already done. So, um, it's a very short section. So, we've set the stage for the Great Depression. You got Black Thursday, Black Tuesday, stock market crash, bank runs, Hoover's Harley Smoot tariff, all of these things you need to be carrying with you. And then the last thing we talked about was the bonus army and their push for the check that they believed was rightfully theirs, that was guaranteed to them by the Adjusted Compensation Act. And the Hoover, the president at the time, sends in Douglas MacArthur to eliminate the bonus army from Washington, D.C. So times are pretty rough for a good portion of Americans. Hopefully, you remember that the unemployment rate was around 25%. That's one out of every four people. And so you had situations like this. And I don't think any of us really can fathom the experiences of losing everything. Obviously, you guys, most of you, I would assume, still live under your parents' roof, and most of the things that you need are provided for you. You know, maybe they make you buy your own clothes if you want to go to Abercrombie or Hollister or something like that. But your parents provide a roof over your head and all the essentials that you need to survive. But I mean, picture this family for a second, and just being a father now of one child and another one about to arrive. I can't imagine this situation for my family. Um, so it was hard for a lot of people, and a lot of Americans ended up committing suicide because they just didn't know how to deal with it. So I think the title for this is perfect. Americans face hard times. Riding the rails as the country plunged deeper into the Great Depression, many young people left home either out of necessity or to follow their dreams of a better life. Nearly a quarter million teenagers hit the road during the early 1930s, jumping freight trains to ride from town to town. Some looked for work, others thirsted for adventure, but all faced the dangers of the hobo life. Charlie Bull, who left his California home at 19, recalled, "You could ride on top of a freight car, and then you just had to be careful. If a train is going 60 or 70 miles an hour and it hits a curve and you're walking and your back's to the turn and you don't see it coming, a little tiny turn can throw you right off the train. A lot of people have been killed like that." Um, Multitude of families are broken up during the Great Depression. Cases like this, where a teenager runs away and decides to try to improve their lives somewhere else. Um, it wasn't just suicides that tore families apart. It wasn't just the financial aspects that tore families apart. It was just families breaking up to determine what was best for their future. So few Americans understood the causes of the Great Depression, but everyone in some way felt the impact. Workers understood that they had a job one day, and the next day they weren't guaranteed that job. Families understood the shame and the fear of losing their homes. There were plenty of people who felt guilt for having a job while their next door neighbor didn't or their family member didn't. So there were a lot of different emotions that play out during the Depression. So between 1921 and 1929, the unemployment rate never rose above 4%. That's fantastic. Right now, we're sitting right around 4%. That's a sign of a healthy economy. By 1933, however, it was near 25%. That's what we talked about previously. Those who managed to keep their jobs had their wages and hours cut, which meant that even them, they weren't unemployed, as I said earlier, but they still had a hard time providing for their families. For most people, both unemployed and not unemployed, a lot of them, the only food available came from public soup kitchens or bread lines run by charitable organizations. Most of those charitable organizations were churches, and people sold their property to buy food. There was one such story that I read about where the guy ran out of gas out of his car, and he didn't have the money to put fuel in the car. So he literally just started selling parts of the car. He started selling the tires. He sold the cushion seats. He sold the steering wheel. He sold whatever he could in order to provide food for himself and for his family. Men and families are going to move as we get into 1931, 1932, 1933. They're going to move from being unemployed to being unemployable. And that might be a little confusing to you. So I'm going to try to help you out here. And if it doesn't make sense, we can talk about it on Monday. The fact that just being unemployed, I mean, anybody could be unemployed. But when you go from being unemployed, just not having a job, to being unemployable, that means that you are, for the lack of a better term, you're a bum. If you pick a guy who has been unemployed and homeless for 30 years and you put him in an interview, he's unemployable. He doesn't fit the suit. Um, he doesn't know how to present himself. So you go from just being unemployed to being unemployable. And that's where situations go from being bad to being worse. Whole families are going to descend into hunger. They're going to descend into homelessness. We're going to get into something in just a second called Hoovervilles. That's going to be this vast array of people, usually in more densely populated areas, that are going to be completely homeless and they live in shacks. Dreams of success, this idea of the American dream, the fact that you can come here from anywhere and succeed, they're going to turn into failure. They're going to turn into poverty, and they're going to turn, in some cases, to suicide. Here's an example of a bread line. People lined up hoping to get some type of rations. The downside to this is when it ran out, it ran out. So the same example I used with the banks and the bank runs, if you're the 30th person in line and they ran out of bread on the 29th person, you might go a day without food. And I can barely go a couple hours without food. I can't imagine having to go a day or two without food. And then here is another prime example. It's super ironic. You have this billboard behind this line, world's highest standard of living. There's no way like the American way. And there's several different things in this one picture. One, you have this billboard in line, and these people, the billboard on the wall, and these people are in line for a soup kitchen. Talk about a standard of living. And then there's another aspect of this. People in the picture are white. It's a white, middle class, maybe upper middle class family doing relatively well. And every single person in that line is African American. So here's another statistic for you. We talked about how overall in the American economy, 25% of the population was unemployed. In the African American community, just the African American community, it was over 50%. 1 out of every 2 African Americans was unemployed. Who was going to be the first one to get fired? African Americans. Who was the last hired? African Americans. Remember, we're still pre-civil civil rights movement at this time, so they took a back seat. In some cases, African Americans even took a back seat over Mexican Americans. All right, I'm going to stop right there. and we'll pick up with the Hoovervilles on the next presentation.